Got it.
Whoops. I should stop touching the screen. That's what I should do. Oh, that's nice.
Okay. Welcome everyone again to the AAUW Diversity Committee's Racism Discussion Series.
Is it blurry or is it just me?
Pardon
It is
me?
blurry.
It's blurry.
Okay.
Is it?
You know,
And
my
we're
end, I
getting-
can't tell. I have to ask.
I don't know why it's blurry or what
Okay.
to make it not blurry.
It's
Hmm.
discernible.
Well, you might not have it in presentation mode. I think you have it in like your preview. So if you go to full presentation, it might.
Let me try this. That's too bright.
Okay, I'm gonna try again. Stop share.
Okay.
We had this
Hey, I don't-
correct. Okay.
Are you going to mute us all too?
Yeah. And we are.
I think that's better.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Are you seeing the full screen?
No.
Peg, I think while we're getting this adjusted, you can stop recording until Linda has this worked.
Everyone,
I'll do it.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for your patience.
I think I muted you.
And I'll fix that. Thank you for your patience as we wrangle with technology. But we would like to welcome everyone to our 5th session in our racism discussion series. This series is being brought to you courtesy of the American Association of University Women, Lake Sumter branch. This is, as you may or may not know, AAUW was established in 1881 with a mission to advance equity for women and girls. We believe that advancing equity for women advances equity for everyone. So we welcome you to this particular discussion. Today, we're going to be discussing post-traumatic slave syndrome. And that's an idea, really a theory that was put forth by Dr. Joy DeGruy. And we'll get to that in a moment, but I've got a couple of quick announcements. Last meeting, we had asked you all to please send us suggestions if there were things you think we ought to do or things that might improve the series. One actually came about during our last session, and that was the book list, which many of you may have already received. This is a list of books that you all suggested, our committee heard about or read. We are in the process now of putting together version 2.0. So if you have additional books that you'd like listed, send them to us and we will put them on the list. We probably will release the new list after the first of the year. One of the suggestions that came through was that we all share the materials that we have sent out in preparation for each discussion. Share them with your friends and family because it may trigger some discussions that could be productive in other venues. Someone also suggested that each of us set up a personal to-do list based on the discussions, what we may want to do as individuals. And that, I think those are great ideas. So you may want to act on those. The committee that has planned these discussions has put together a SurveyMonkey survey that you will likely be seeing right after the first of the year. So watch your email for that. We're looking for some feedback. And finally, we have explored uploading the videos from all of these sessions to YouTube. And one of the things that we need to make sure of is that everybody is aware that their faces will show on YouTube. If you do not want your face seen on YouTube, we strongly urge you to turn off your video and not have video showing. Okay. So,
Also, Linda, excuse me.
yes,
Along with that, if you do not want your name to be seen, you can change your name and put some kind of nickname on there so
Huh.
we can call you if you have a question. So just those two items, face and name.
okay. So today we are again going to be using breakout sessions and polling. So we need to make sure that our technology is working for all of us. Today's agenda, we're going to look at a quick video. We will then do our breakout groups. We'll come back for a large group discussion. We'll do our polling and then we will wrap up. So here we go. Peg, you're going to want to start the recording now. Let me stop sharing this. Go away. Because we have a little video we want to watch. Hopefully you all watched the long DeGruy video that we sent the link to. It was an hour. Some of you may not have had a chance to see that. So we have a short little DeGruy video, about 5 minutes or so. And we're going to watch that now and then go into our breakout groups. So if my technology works right, here we go. Just a moment. Nope, wrong one. Just a minute.
Post-traumatic slave syndrome is an explanatory
stop,
theory.
Joy, just
Post-traumatic
stop.
slave syndrome is an explanatory theory that really looks at multi-generational trauma. One of the things that's difficult for people is their first response is, oh my God, that happened so long ago. We're talking about people being captured, shipped, sold, beaten, raped, experimented on. And then you have to ask the question, did the trauma continue? Yes, so 300 years of trauma, no help, freed. No help, more trauma. If it's a sustained trauma, then the impact of that is also sustained. When we look at multi-generational trauma, we're looking at people who are maybe victims of natural disasters and their families and their children and generations of folks who have experienced war. And we know that there are residual mental, emotional, traumatic impact. And what I did was I started to look at the African-American experience, starting with slavery, as a real clear, long enduring trauma. I started to see that there were clear connections between that survival behavior and contemporary living in African-American experience. I started to see common behaviors that I took for granted as, well, cultural. There's adaptive behaviors, survival behaviors. Well, what are they? Let's just say 2019, you have a black mother and a white mother. The sons go to school together. They find themselves at a meeting. The black mother leans over to the white mother and says, I just wanted to mention to you that I noticed that your son is really doing quite well. And the white mother's response is, oh, thank you. She begins to go on and on about he won the science fair, his uncle's an astronaut. She's just oozing. She realizes the black mother's son is actually excelling her son. And she says, well, wait a minute. Your son's the one that's really coming along. And the black mother responds, oh my God, he's a handful, but oh, he just works my nerves. Now, when I'm working with African-American people, it doesn't matter what the audience is. It doesn't matter what class. If I were to ask, is she very proud while she's saying those denigrating things? And everybody laughs and goes, of course, there's a secret. Because everybody black knows that even though the black mother is going, oh my God, she's really proud. So now let's roll that scene back 300 years. And let's say this black mother is working in the fields and a white slave owner comes through and says, wow, that boy is really coming along. What is she gonna say? No, he's not. He's stupid. He's shiftless. He can't work because I don't want you to sell him. So I denigrate them to protect them. That is called appropriate adaptation when living in a hostile environment. The little white boy, say Timmy, he feels really comfortable and happy about what his mom just said about him. And Trey looks at his mom and wonders, why can't you be proud of me? Because he doesn't understand the secret yet. And by the time he learns the secret, he will have already been injured by it. Post-traumatic slave syndrome. PTSD is a disorder that occurs as a result of a single trauma. You don't even have to be there to actually get a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. You could just hear about something horrific happening to someone you love. So you have people who have experienced it firsthand, people who have witnessed it in their environment, right? People who are continuing to be oppressed. That exacerbates any possibility of healing. So it's not post-traumatic stress disorder, because then it becomes part of what we call your socialization process. So you begin to normalize a way of living and being, everything from what we eat to what we believe it means to be a friend. You know, all of these things are colored by history. And if you don't understand it, you're going to fold in things that you've just assumed are normal. But post-traumatic stress disorder, you know, exaggerated startle response, outbursts of anger, feeling of foreshortened future. There was a point where there were, you know, African-American children in different urban settings that didn't expect to live to be adults because they saw so much death, that they started planning their funerals like at 13, 12, as young as 10. When you start looking at the simple biology, you start looking at the impact of stress on health. And while we look at general stress, you know, we know finances, you have illnesses, all these different things. How about being Black? How does factoring in being Black in America impact your stress level and therefore your body's ability to operate its own immune system? Because we know it compromises the immune system. Once you understand it, then you can deal with it, because you see it's habitual. You socialize, it becomes part of your being. So one of the ways you begin to address that multi-generational trauma is to work with the people it directly impacts, to hear from them. And when you give the people the information, they can use it. I think the first order of business is beginning to have a conversation. And the other is to educate the larger society. You have to stop the assault. So this is not purely a clinical thing. This requires social justice and change. That's where part of the healing is. It's not in a clinical setting or in a pill. It's in fairness and justice and safety and equity. We got to work with some of those clinical things, some of those issues of panic and anxiety. And we also have to deal with the fact that you have a system that is set up to oppress you and to continue to injure you. Both those things have to be dealt with. And they cannot singularly by themselves affect a change. They have to be done collectively.
To share. Okay, let's do this. We're going to go into the breakout groups now. And this is what we'd like you to chat about in the breakout groups. We've talked a lot about slavery, the impact of slavery, but what one thing about the impact of slavery that you didn't know before, but learned from DeGruy's video? Chat on, folks. Are back, mostly.
Nice job, Linda.
We don't ask that the breakout groups report out, because people have talked about things that may be personal or private or that they didn't want to share with everyone. So when we come out of these breakout rooms, we ask if there were aha moments that you would care to share. If you would, please raise your electronic hand. I will recognize you in the order in which you raise your electronic hand. Jackie will unmute you or ask you to unmute yourself, and she will also lower your hand when you're done speaking. So anything come out of your small group discussions that you would like to share with the larger group?
Again,
I'm seeing Aleda. Am I saying your name right?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, you're first. Tag, you're it.
Kind of the primary reason that I'm speaking is because I'm probably I think I'm the only person of color on this call.
we have someone else.
Ah, okay, there are at least two of us, all right.
Yes, Annette is here.
All right, I wanted to say thank you for doing this. It has been an amazing experience for me. I wanted to log in every time you all have met and something else was going on and I couldn't attend. So I just wanted to say thank you. And this has been a tremendous experience for me. I didn't get to see the whole video, I think DeGruy, but just what the part of it that I saw was like mind-boggling for me as a Black person. So thank you all for having these sessions.
Thank you, and thank you for being here. We hope that more and more people of color will hear about these sessions and choose to participate, because otherwise it's sort of like self-stimulation, which never really goes very well. We know that. But thank you, and we're glad you're here. Katie.
I have one comment, and then I see that Gay does have her hand up, and if she didn't, I was going to ask her to please do it. One comment that I shared with the group, my husband was a professor at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, RPI, in Troy, New York. And Eddie Knowles was a Black man who was the Dean of Students and had a PhD, was Dr. Knowles. And a comment that Eddie made just has always stayed with me. And that was, the first thing that comes to mind for him when he gets up every morning is, what does the white man want from me today? Just a powerful thing to have that kind of an impact on this man who had, you know, gone far in life in terms of academics, but that was a constant for him. So, and I'm just so glad that Gay is going to share her input.
Wow, that's powerful stuff. And it echoes through virtually everything I'm reading these days. So it's hard to imagine yourself in a different skin, but maybe that's the essence of empathy, to be able to imagine what that would be like. And it's unimaginable. Yeah. Thank you, Katie.
I have to just, excuse me, one technical point. If you're raising your hand mechanically, keep your eye out, because if you're going to be the next person to speak, we ask you to do that, to unmute yourself beforehand. And if you're not watching, that doesn't happen. So right now we're going to go to Gay.
Okay, this is just real.
Actually, Espy was next, I think.
But she didn't reduce, so we're going to go to Gay and then we'll go to
Okay,
Espy.
and then we'll come back to you, Espy. I got it.
You
Thank
have to
you,
unmute
Jackie.
yourself, yes.
Okay, I just was going to talk about what we talked about I used to work at a university hospital, and we did heart transplants, started doing heart transplants quite a few years ago. And the lady who gave our lecture talked about these animals that, you know, that they would dislike this peppermint smell, and then they would, the second generation who had no experience with the peppermint smell would dislike that smell too.
Oh,
and
yeah.
then the third generation was still disliking this smell, and they, you know, it was like a genetic thing that was bringing this to the next generation. Well, we learned that the heart itself, the muscles in the heart are special muscles, and they were bringing from the recipient, who, you know, obviously died because his heart was transplanted to another person, that the person who received the heart had memories of things that the recipient had. Things like things that this person would have never known before they had that heart transplant. And we heard different lecturers come to the hospital and explain to us about it. And I always thought that was just so unusual to think about, the heart muscle itself carrying these things to the new person. But it's sort of like what she's talking about. how this genetics carries on these things. Haven't heard any heart transplant people lately, but I don't know. But that was one of my comments. So
Interesting. That whole topic of epigenetics that she talked about, which is the transmitter of these things.
Right.
It's not in the DNA, it's sort of on top of it. But that, I thought that was fascinating. And it would be interesting, I think, to study what happens in transplant cases, particularly of the heart. That would be interesting to look at. Fascinating. Thank you. Espy.
Yes, for me, I learned a lot. I realized the sufferings that they went through, 400 years of oppression. I don't know if I would have survived it myself. Even if I have that in my lifetime, it would be a very, very tough and a lot of emotional wounds and pain that I have to deal with. I'm sure they're still dealing with it to this day. Now, recognizing that, I felt like, okay, I have to move on. What do I do from now on? That was the past. I got a better understanding, grasp of it. Now, what do I do now as a Black person, as a white person, to help them, move on? And I think that's a very tough thing. And I think what we are doing, I recognize it, is the first step, bringing it out there and making everybody aware, the Black and the white. And the other one that I have learned on this matter is that conversation, uncomfortable conversation with the Black man, that was one-on-one, that was terrific. I hope we can see more something like that, or something what we're doing now.
It will.
Thanks, Espy. The topics that are coming up are obviously the ones that resonated with all of us, but the notion of resilience, how does a people manage to stand up, continue to remain upright, take nourishment, do whatever, given 400 years of that kind of trauma? So the resilience piece for me is amazing. And I wonder, you may want to think about this. It's hard for me to say anything other than, as a group, Black people are amazingly resilient. What contributes to that? I'm not sure that I know. So I toss that out. Think about that. But Lynn Hunter is next.
Two thoughts. One was, I think, this is slightly different, but this is one of those teachable moments. Am I unmuted, Jack?
You're good.
Yeah, you are. You're good.
One of those teachable moments when we talk about the inoculations coming up, and that Black and brown community are reluctant to be inoculated. And we pass over the Tuskegee thing like everybody should know about it, and offer that as a reason why Black and brown folks might be a little reluctant to take these inoculations. And there have been so many more situations like the Tuskegee experiments. Henrietta Lacks was the woman what would we take of hers, or ovaries or whatever, something, and used them to experiment and never even asked permission from her family. I mean, there are so many. This would be a wonderful time to educate the white population, especially, on why the Black and brown communities are, so the white community doesn't go, oh, well, how come they're not willing to do this? So that we don't get into that. I just think information right now would be really, really helpful. And I don't see anybody really doing it. Even when we mentioned the Tuskegee experiments, we pass over them. Nobody stops to talk any more about them than just that they were. And I don't know that everybody knows what they were. So Black and brown communities have a lot of reason to be reluctant to take that vaccine. So it's a teachable moment. I hate to see us pass it by.
Yeah, I think you're right. And you raise a really interesting point. I recently read a really horrific book called Medical Apartheid. I don't know if any of you have heard of it.
It's a good one.
But it's you got to have a strong stomach for it, folks. Which supports the notion of how do you come with resilience after the thing's done. But this book documents not just Tuskegee, but going back hundreds of years, medical experiments, medical treatment, medical lack of treatment, that in particular Black people have been subjected to. Small screaming wonder if they don't trust the medical community. And by the way, the pandemic, I'll get off my soapbox in a minute. The pandemic has illustrated and highlighted those systemic structural racism elements that have contributed to more people of color getting the disease, dying of the disease. I think Joy DeGruy is correct. Social justice needs to come about. And I'm not a person who does delayed gratification really well. So we're having these discussions. I want social justice now, you know. So if I want it now, imagine how people of color feel. But we're on this individual level here. And I think that's the teachable moment. But we somehow need to branch this discussion out, I think, a little more broadly to the systemic elements that need to be changed and consider how we might feed into that, because people's lives are at stake. Step down and shut your mouth.
All right. I think Aletta Wilson is
coming back.
Speak.
Yes.
Please, Miss Aletta.
A couple of other things. One is the way my husband and I live, based upon the time period that we grew up in this country, that we mention to friends, but they have, when we mention it, they have no understanding of what we're talking about. For instance, there was a restaurant that we wanted to go to over by some lake, not too far from here. And from the outside, it looked a little kind of sketchy. But we like basic down-to-earth places, so we decided we would try it. And we joked to our friends, well, we're not sure whether we would be welcome there or not. So maybe we need to go with some of our white friends. And I could tell clearly from their faces, they had zero idea of what we were talking about. So even though we said it in a joking way, that is very true for us in many instances that we don't know how we will be received. And from our professional lives, both of us were in positions where frequently we had to speak before groups, and you'd walk out on a stage and you could see that, first of all, the people in the audience were surprised that there was a Black person coming to speak. And I can imagine what was going through their minds until we started to speak. So it's been an interesting life growing up here in the United States. And we look at people that we know who come from the islands who have an entirely different mindset. Yeah. They're very secure in their skins. They talk about us Black Americans who have grown up in this country and why are we so fearful of everything? So one's upbringing and background, et cetera, make a huge difference in terms of how one operates within the world. One last thing is the African American Club is preparing to make a presentation to the village's owners about the concept of diversity and inclusion, to basically ask them to step up and make more than a statement, but to be active in terms of diversity and inclusion in the villages. So that's just kind of an FYI, and I may be in contact with one of the leaders of this group to see if you would support the idea, and then I'll provide more information.
Yeah, I think we have chatted with Chuck Singleton about that. And yes, count us in.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you again. Karen Sawhill.
Yeah, I read Joy's book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, and I've learned about DNA, you know, and how it's the research that she did on this and what that's, you know, what her what this whole thing is about, you know, what she's presenting, that it's passed through, the trauma was passed through the generations. And I witnessed firsthand this with a friend of mine who has a 7-year-old daughter who is really, really smart. And the mom is just, the African-American mom is so worried that her daughter is going to end up getting in trouble. She's 7 years old, but she's worried she's going to be bad. So she's constantly denigrating her, holding her down, holding her back. And this mother is such a caring person with other people. And yet with her daughter, she really puts her down a lot. And she had a parent-teacher conference with the child's teacher. And the teacher said, "What can I say? She's perfect. She helps the other kids in the class. She's my best student. She does, you know, she helps other people out. She's on time." You know, she couldn't say enough good things about this child, and her mom was just sort of floored with it. And they even make her do her schoolwork on Saturday, just the same way as on all the other days, because they don't want her to get behind. And she's the best student in the class now. And so I said to her, "Are you going to let her know what her teacher said about her?" And she was surprised by the question. She said, "I never even thought of it. Never even occurred to me to say any of the good things to her." And she was shocked and upset with herself that she hadn't even thought about that. And so what she decided, as we were talking on the phone, what she ended up deciding was that they were going to tell her about the, you know, like let her know what were some of the characteristics that the teacher commented on that she is exhibiting in the classroom, and also to have a celebration. They ended up having a popcorn movie party that night, which is her favorite thing to do with her parents. And so this friend who is, you know, I've known forever is, you know, I recently saw her do another one of these where, you know, it was her normal response would be to sort of slap it down. And she's starting to change that behavior because we shone a light on it. And I think that's one of the things that Joy talks about is you educate, you know, once she would tell people about the whole DNA thing and why it's happening, then they can change it. And so this friend is starting to change some of those behaviors. So that was really powerful.
That's a wonderful story, and it kind of relates to the point that Espy was making before, as well as what DeGruy is saying, that you stop the behavior, you change it, and it can change that epigenetic impact because the genes can now be expressed without that extra baggage on it.
But you have to know you have to be aware of why you're doing that. I think that was the big aha for me.
Yeah. And I think that for me, it's easy to say, "Oh, just do it, you know, just change that behavior." Professionally, I know it doesn't work that way, that change is slow coming, but very cool that you were able to have that kind of an impact. And by the way, I think Kendi would call that an anti-racism action, which is sort of another interesting little piece there. Very cool. Judy Reinhardt.
Yes, ma'am. Back to this epigenetic part of the presentation. I believe in cellular memory and have for a long time, and was involved in anesthesia for heart transplants some years ago. And I guess 3 years ago, we were in Alaska and had gone on a bear hunting expedition for photography. And the Native Alaskan man who was our leader was telling us that he had a severe heart attack. I guess 5 years before that, was evacuated to Washington State and had a heart transplant. And so I said to him, because of my experience, well, have you noticed anything different about yourself after your transplant? And he just looked at me. He said, I just love to arrange flowers. And I said, well, it's a cellular memory of the 19-year-old girl whose heart you have. He was touched. I was touched, because it was like you interface with one person that it makes a difference. And so you never know when that's going to happen. And so I will never forget the incident. I don't know how he feels about it, but cellular memory is real. And when you think of all these kids who have this stuff stuck in their cells, how do you get through this? Maybe one person at a time, one cell at a time, but we can make a difference.
I hope it's a bigger unit of measurement than one cell at a time.
Right.
Yeah. But that, you know, that just reinforces what Gay was talking about before. Very cool. Yeah. Very cool. Okay. Christine, Loken Kim, you know, you've got mountains in the background and I see you're wearing a vest. Are you, you're here in the Villages because it's freezing outside.
I am, it's freezing, but I decided to put the New Hampshire mountains behind me.
There you go. And very appropriate with your attire. I like it.
Yeah. I mentioned in my small group that I worked as an administrator in the African American Studies program at Boston University for about 8 years. So I started learning a few things. I'm amazed that I just keep learning more. So that didn't solve all my, you know, issues or whatever. But one thing that I did, I became aware of, and Alita mentioned that, and that is that we look and we white people, we see Black and brown people. But within that, the ones that are coming from the Caribbean, the ones that are coming from Africa, they have such a different view. And they get really angry and irritated. They don't want to be called African American. They want to be, you know, Caribbeans or whatever. And really, they're very prejudiced against African Americans, who they see as lazy and all of these things with this slave syndrome. And they see America as this great place with all these opportunities. But the really ironic thing is they have children here, and their children are growing up and people react to them as African Americans. And so they see their kids becoming exactly what they hated when they first came here. It's very upsetting to many of them. In fact, I had this one professor, she's from the Caribbean. She married a white guy, and she's a very respected professor, but she will say that she's never experienced any racism. Well, that's because she walks around under John's umbrella. She's always with John. When they go to buy a house, he goes. Of course they sell him the house in any place in Boston, any place. And then she just shows up and, but then she's got a British accent. Oh, so she's different. So she says she hasn't experienced any racism. I think that's a little exaggeration, but both of her girls they're very high flyers, but they're struggling. And I can tell they're really struggling as biracial. One of them moved off to England. She couldn't handle America. The other is, neither of them, they're both in their 30s. Neither of them have married. They idolize their father. They probably want to marry a white guy because he's their idol. You know, anyway, it's very complicated. And I just wanted to say one other thing. In the summer, when all of these, you know, demonstrations were happening, and some of the news people would say, well, you know, the Blacks and their allies are out. And I was like, what allies? What are you talking about? I just hadn't thought of that. And I guess I didn't think of myself as I didn't apply that word. I sort of thought, well, of course they have a point. Of course, everybody should see they have a point. Why do they need allies? But now I realize I want to be an ally.
Absolutely.
So I don't know what, I need to think of myself. Yes, I'm an ally. I'm not just going to sit passively and go, oh, that's too bad. Of course, they have a right to be demonstrating, and but anyway, it's a long process. Let me tell you, I can't believe I started working African American studies in 2001, and almost every time I read a new book, it's like, oh my gosh, that's new. It's American history without the African American part is just not American history.
That's right.
All that stuff we learned is just not what it's at.
Thank you, Christine. You made so many points that are so important. The notion of being an ally, for myself, I'm moving in that process as well. As I read, as I talk to people, as I learn more, I want to be an anti-racist, and to be that means that I'm an ally, because I'm on the side of Black people. I think the social justice piece is enormous, and it needs to be dealt with.
Excuse me.
One of the other,
Excuse me, Linda. A friend of mine, he said, white people have the power, and that's why when you're Black, you need white allies. So that's, I think, again, that goes with it. Those of us, we have to stand up when we're working on being anti-racist. We need to speak out when we see an injustice and be supportive. So that idea of being an ally, I think that's an important piece. And for all of us to get to that point, to want to be and act as allies, that's a plus. It shouldn't be needed, but until it's not, I think that's maybe why we're trying to educate ourselves to be better allies. So thank you for raising that, Christine.
yeah, I think it's a really good point. Yeah, Christine.
I just want to say one other thing about the allies, because I was listening to NPR yesterday and about that. And that is that as we declare ourselves to be allies, we have to vote that way. We have to know what things are coming up and how they affect everybody, and vote for equal justice. And I think it's very well, what this person yesterday at NPR was saying is that, they were talking, it was part of that uncomfortable conversations with a Black man that SB mentioned.
Yeah.
He said, what can you be a racist, a reverse racist? And they said, well, if you think about it, racism is thinking about oppressing a certain group. And the things that people call reverse racism are actually about uplifting. They're not about oppressing the opposite group. So, it's like all these years, the whites have oppressed, and when Black and brown people, when African American people say equal justice, the whites hear, oh, I have to go down. They want me down. And nobody ever said down. They just said equal. And it always gets me. People get so upset. It's like, oh, they want to oppress me. I can't have my stuff, right? But all they're saying is, hey, equal. So
There's a series on YouTube that has come up a couple of times. Let me make sure everybody's aware of it. It's called Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man. There have been about 10 episodes at least out there. The Black man is Emmanuel Acho, who apparently, I looked at the first one and I thought, my God, he's either a bodybuilder or a professional football player, and he's a professional football player. He's this ginormous guy, but very sensitive. And in his first session, he made it clear that he wanted to have these conversations to bring out in the open topics that are hard to talk about. If you go on YouTube and just search for Emmanuel Acho, ACHO, or uncomfortable conversations with a Black man, the entire series will come up. And none of them are very long. I think the longest I saw was maybe 20, 25 minutes. But they are quite wonderful. And yeah, take a look at that. Okay.
Lisa Beavers.
Lisa Beavers.
No, just real quick, some things from Joy DeGruy that stood out is you can't fix what we don't understand. And also Emmanuel goes through that same thing. We have to first come to understanding to be able to fix something. So when you hear that Joy says, you know, these 400 years almost of the racial injustice, can you imagine that back then you are 100 years into it, it's getting better, I have hope. And then 200 years, still I have hope, I'm still going to struggle, I'm still going to. Can you even imagine? All of us probably have heard or had some trauma in our life, and it's still with us. Can you imagine 400 years? Can you imagine that we don't even bring to the table in our educational system that 17 million may have passed from slavery? The trip over, we had 6 million pass in the horrible Auschwitz and the genocide. And when I even heard in her book, one of the books on caste that I'm reading right now, is where were the people? Where was that in their mind that was okay? Why weren't they standing up and having conversation and saying this is not right? But Joy brings this point at the very beginning of her talk. And she says, these people of African descent were a miracle. The resilience you're talking, I'm holding them in such high regard that what they have gone through, the people who've struggled the most sometimes have the most resilience and the most spiritual essence, I think. And I'm putting it where we have to do the work now. You know, our ancestors, we have maybe not enslaved someone, but we still are through not having the justice system. And Joy is really about the truth. And if we don't step into the arena of these tough and uncomfortable conversations and help to fix the social injustice, we could lose our country, because it is said that there are outside our country and within our country elements and people who are trying to put us against each other, you know, and if we don't come to, it's like our most vulnerable moments are when you're in a fight with somebody, and to pit us against each other could be the demise of this experiment of the America. And that we have to come to this united front. You saw it when the marches were going on and people are arm in arm. It's a united front that makes such a difference. It's changed this country even. So I don't mean to preach, because that was not what I was supposed to be doing, but anyways.
Okay. Thank you. I hear what you're saying, and here is one concern that bubbles up in my mind. Many of us were spurred to action with the murder of George Floyd. That's certainly where this particular discussion series came from, although we all came out of a social consciousness sort of background. But George Floyd was murdered 6 or 7 months ago. And people have maybe moved on with the things that they're concerned about. how do we sustain this? How do we keep the conversation going so that it doesn't fall by the wayside, and whatever glimmer of hope we may have for a better future dies out. So consider that for a while, because I think we need to think about that as well. In the meantime, Katie Haviland, you're up.
Okay, just picking up on Lisa's being proactive, and I think that's, and what several others have said, I think Christine was saying, somewhat of the same thing, that we need to think of how we can move things ahead. And I think one of the things that I remember that Joyce said, when the grandchildren talking with someone who said, well, I don't know how our children got to think the way they think because we've brought them up to be open-minded, and there's this tendency for them to, and said, well, so where do they go in the summer? Well, they go to their grandparents who are very biased, and she said, okay, so here's one thing that you could do. One suggestion is have a conversation with them before they go. So again, it's open, it's getting it out in the open, it's talking about it freely and saying, now, this is what we believe and this is how we act. And Grandma and Grandpa don't think the way that we do. So when they talk that way, that's okay. That's the way that they think. And you don't have to say anything. You don't have to agree with them. You don't have to disagree with them. You're just there. But just remember, that's not the way that we act. That's not the way that we think. That's not the way that we talk. And the kids come back and they say, oh yeah, you know what? That's exactly what they said. So it's not that the children are being influenced and aren't aware of what's happening, but it's talking with them, this is who we are. This is how we treat people. This is how we talk about people. This is how we lift each other up. And Christine, you were saying that it's not that anybody's coming down to any level. We are the rising tide. We are bringing each other up and helping to maintain that upness.
Thank you. Lynn Hunter.
Yeah, I think this came from Joy's talk. And it just reminds me of the white people that I talk to who hope that there eventually will be a way that they can keep their white privilege and you all can heal anyway. It's like, can't we fix this and still keep our white privilege? We don't care if Colin Kaepernick goes down to one knee or not, but we want to keep our white stuff. And in socialism, it's like, I want to hold on to my stuff. And can we find a way for you to get free while I don't let anything go? And it's that zero sum idea, so instead of, equality, they don't understand equality. I mean, excuse me, most white men don't understand equality, period. But it's that whole idea we can be equal. We don't have to have somebody down and somebody up. Isn't that amazing thought? So I think there's a fear, and I know from personal experience, there's can I just hold on a little longer until we figure out how the Black folks can fix this and we can still keep our stuff, our privilege. I don't want to let go of what I got.
Really interesting to expect Black people to fix a problem that is a white people problem.
We break your legs and then
we seems a little backward to me.
Yeah.
I've been reading a book entitled Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. Very powerful. It's written as a letter to his son. And in it, he refers to people who think they're white, people who need to believe that they are white. He doesn't ever just refer to white people. He refers to that need to be white to sort of justify their existence. It was a little startling the first time I saw it, but if you consider that the race issue is a white issue because it's important for white people to be white. That challenges our status. And interestingly, there was an article by a woman by the name of Nell Painter. She's a historian. And she wrote an opinion piece on whether you should capitalize the B in Black or not. And it was an interesting piece. And I came to the conclusion that we ought not to capitalize anything. She said, if you capitalize Black, then you have to capitalize white. But if you're not capitalizing white, then you're denying that it is a race. So if I want to remove that whole race piece, then I capitalize nothing. But it's an interesting issue, but we digress. Karen Sawhill.
Yeah, one of the things that Joy points out in her work is that white people have been traumatized by slavery too. And while that it doesn't seem to be her area of study, she mentions it on several of her publications. And according to the science, one act of trauma can cause the trauma to be passed down through the DNA. And if you think about white people during times of slavery and what happened afterwards, there was white people contributed to a lot of trauma by the acts that were committed against people that they believed or came to believe as not being human. And so there's a trauma there. And what Joy points out, that while we hold the DNA, that trauma in our DNA as well as Black people do, in our case, it got passed on as a sense of superiority and as a way to justify the actions that made Black people less than human. And so I think that, for me as a white person, I don't know if it got passed on to me. My ancestors came here from Sweden in the early 1900s. So I don't know if it's one of those collective consciousness kind of things, but I live here in America. And so I have the disease of racism just as much as anybody else. And so, but that sense of superiority is the thing that I get to work on. That's my work, is to clear that, that we're all one. I get to clear that from my DNA, from my words, from my actions. Yeah, and not pass it on to the next generation.
Thank you. We're going to jump over Christine for a minute and go to Annette because she was having trouble finding her raised hand and she's been wanting to speak. So Annette, Gail.
Hey, am I muted? I'm muted, I think.
No, you're not.
No,
You're
okay,
good.
I'm not. So I wanted to, again, just like Alita said, I wanted to compliment your group on having this discussion and being willing to have this discussion and to be able to listen to each other and hear what we each have to say. And, I think it was maybe you, Lisa, that was talking about, you have to understand something and acknowledge it before you can change it. And I was having a discussion, a lively discussion with someone a few weeks ago about the Confederate flag and the renaming of bases. And she could not understand. She was like, it's part of the country's history. And I was trying to tell her, Hitler is also a part of Germany's history, but you don't see any statues to him, throughout Germany. It's just not there. And so I wanted to read to you something that I read to her so that she could understand why we feel so strongly about the Confederate flag not being flown, and the way we feel about bases being named after people who owned slaves and perpetrated it. So William T. Thompson is the person who created the Confederate battle flag. And this is what he said: "As a people, we are fighting to maintain the heaven-ordained supremacy of the white man over the inferior or colored race. A white flag would thus be emblematic of our cause. Upon a red field would stand forth our Southern Cross, gemmed, preserving in beautiful contrast the red, white, and blue." So many people don't even know that the person who created the flag created it specifically because he believed that it was heaven ordained for white supremacy to be in place. Just like a lot of people don't know that the stanzas of the anthem that are not sung are have several places which uphold slavery. And so Colin Kaepernick taking that knee was important. And it was also important now looking back on it, because a lot of Black people feel that we can't win for losing, because that was a peaceful and nonviolent protest on his part.
I thought so too.
And yes, and then, but it was met with such backlash. He still cannot get a job in the the NFL. And so when we do protest peacefully, it is met and received as something else, because of the fact that the understanding of the meaning behind the anthem is not there. So it's not that we don't love this country. It's not that we won't fight for this country. We did fight for this country. But when you look at things like even the VA housing bill, which happened not actually too long ago, like back in the 40s, 50s, which allowed vets to be able to buy houses, but we couldn't find a bank that would loan to Black people to buy a house. And so therefore that bill left us out completely, just because the avenues that you had to take to be able to get the financing were closed to us. And so it's like you feel like you take one step forward, but you take 3 steps backwards. So great, I fought for my country too, I get to do this. And so then you look at the fact that, okay, we couldn't buy houses, which then meant that a lot of generational wealth has been lost, because there are so many families that were able to buy houses and pass those houses down through the generations. It's the family, the family home, whatever. And we all know owning property is major. It is major. And so we lost a lot of decades as well, not being able to create generational wealth from that standpoint. But I just wanted to bring up that conversation I had with her, and she had no idea that the person who created the flag, that was his reason for doing it.
Thank you. Your insights are really powerful. I read several years ago, I read Mitch Landrieu's book, In the Shadow of Statues, which I would recommend to people. It's quite powerful. And in fact, the whole Confederate monument issue is one that we have ready to go for this series at some point. But, it's always a question of what topic should we do next? Because, gee, there are so many good ones.
There's so many, yes.
Yeah. So I think we're not going to have the problem of running out of topics. Thank you.
I think I want to build on what Annette said.
Okay.
I'd had my hand up.
Okay.
2 things exactly like what she said. After I find so many things because of what we're watching. And so after I watched this post-traumatic slave syndrome, farther down in my YouTube queue was one called, Why Aren't There Many Black People in Oregon? And I have a sister and brother who live in Oregon, and everybody loves Oregon. It was an amazing thing, and if you can find it, it's outrageous. And there's also one about from the Minnesota Historical Association on the covenants that were signed when they built housing areas in Minneapolis. And they've done a lot of work, and it's the those housing loans that Annette was mentioning. They actually had it written in the US, the law, that unless there were covenants on the deeds of the houses, they couldn't get a loan. So the covenants had to say that you would not sell this house to a Black person or resell it to a Black person. And to this day, those covenants are still on all those houses. They're not enforceable, but they're still there. And so there was this one man who came up in the YouTube thing, and he wasn't the person basically presenting these things, but he said the biggest lie in America is that most people think that these things happen naturally. It's just natural that there are only white people in my neighborhood. It's just natural that there are only white people, or mostly all white people in Oregon. And if you look at the history, it is not. And that's where the structural racism comes in. And in the one about why there aren't more Black people in Oregon, the Constitution of Oregon says that no Black people will come in, and that you would get publicly whipped once every 6 months for with a big whip until you left Oregon if you were a Black person who came to Oregon.
And they haven't managed to amend that yet, huh?
No, and then they had, and they kept fighting it. And recently there was some change, but people say, well, of course, why didn't they just go, oh my gosh, we didn't know that was in there. They did know it was in there, and they kept bringing it up and bringing it up, and they would still say, well, that is what we want to say about Oregon. And that there was this one area in Portland, because I couldn't understand why, Oregon? Portland? Why is Portland exploding and on exploding? Well, there's one area in Portland where they made all the Black people live, and it's called the Albina neighborhood. And every time they decide to make a new conference center, make a new road, they decide to go right through Albina and then just take out all the houses. And they took out all these houses, and then they didn't have money for, and of course they don't relocate anybody anywhere else because they can't live in those other areas. They're only, so I mean, it's really.
That's not peculiar to Portland, that it goes on all over. And I think we need to have a conversation about that sometime too.
So the big thing is that, we tend to think that it's just natural. Well, it just happened that there are no Black people in my neighborhood, but that is totally not true. And that's where we can be allies and make sure that they don't put those laws in.
Thank you. Jenny Rivera, you're going to have the last word here, and then we have another thing we want to do, which we're kind of excited about. Jenny.
Okay. Christine kept talking about they. We recently discussed redlining and the VA law that enabled people to buy houses. I'm pretty sure that law didn't say, yo, banks, don't do this for Black people. Who's the they who builds this structure of racism? How do they get away with it year after year? I don't think any of us ever voted for someone who said, I want white supremacy. There are people who have been elected who say that, but I don't think any of us voted for them. I wish there were a way that we could fix they.
I think we're going to have to put that on our to-do list with the first discussion of who is they. But it's a good point, Jenny. Thank you. Okay. Peg, who has been doing our recording and therefore can't raise her electronic hand, asked me to make this point. and I will, and then we're going to move on. It's not just DeGruy who claims this, but archaeological evidence has shown that we are 99.9% the same, which I suspect to hardcore racists is a real shock to their system, and hard to swallow. But I think that we are operating, I know I am operating on that premise. We are the same under the skin, and we need to behave that way. Okay. This discussion has been incredible. I had a whole list of questions that, gee, if things flagged, I might have asked, and no need, because all of those topics came up. As we have said, Black people show enormous resilience. So we would like to share with you an artistic take on that resilience. So cross your fingers that my technology is going to work, and we're on.
You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still like dust, I'll rise. Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom? Just 'cause I walk as if I have oil wells pumping in my living room. Just like suns and like moons, with the certainty of tides, just like hope springing high. Still I rise. Did you want to see me broken? Bowed head and lowered eyes, shoulders falling down like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries. Does my sassiness upset you? Don't take it so hard just 'cause I laugh. As if I have gold mines digging in my own backyard. You can shoot me with your words. You can cut me with your lies. You can kill me with your hatefulness. But just like life, I'll rise. Does my sexiness offend you? Oh, does it come as a surprise that I dance as if I have diamonds at the meeting of my thighs? Out of the huts of history's shame I rise. Up from a past rooted in pain I rise. A black ocean leaping and wide, welling and swelling, I bear in the tide. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into a daybreak miraculously clear, I rise. Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave. I am the hope and the dream of the slave. And so, naturally, there I go rising.
We're back. Whoa, stop. Forgot to click that off. Do we want to talk for a minute or two about resilience? Because we have some polling that we want to do, and we need to kind of wrap up in the next 15, 20 minutes. SV, unmute, dear. You need to unmute.
Anyway, what stays with me with that video is one of the things that I seem to digest is the parenting. Right from the start, we have to parent those kids, not to put them down. If they have some accomplishment, recognize them, acknowledge them. You did a good job, just like in that video. You're great, you're doing well. so that they grow up not feeling less than because of their color. I think I can relate that on my personal experience. As I was growing up, that was ingrained with us. I think it's part of growing up. A kid would feel inferior than the other kids. No, you'll be better if you go to school, learn things, and not do things. You'd be as good or even better than that kid. So I grew up with that idea that I'm just as good as anybody else. I think those right from the start, I think they have to ingrain that, or they have to correct it from the parenting, you know. Yeah, you're doing well, you're great, recognize them, acknowledge them, then somebody put you down and you're okay. You kind of bounce back. You have other good traits, or you know, that you can do it type of thing. Then they grow up not feeling less than, and because of the historical background and so forth, it would probably, that's just my thinking, it would probably overcome that first step. Now, what do we do with the one that have learned to denigrate themselves? Now, the one that we are doing, what we're doing now is helping them, making aware. So I have to undo it and change their attitude. Okay, that was a history, that was bad, you know, all the ones. What do I do from now on to overcome it? And if we have this opportunity of the conversation, open conversation, probably it should be one of them to say, yeah, these are my feelings, these are my thoughts. That's just my.
You know, I think that's probably a heavy element in resilience. But I think back 400 years and the families were decimated. I mean, if your husband or your wife or your kid could be sold south, the strength of that family bond is kind of destroyed. From what I've read, the sense of community, church, family, the spiritual connections have contributed to some of that resilience over time. But you know, I think it's worth thinking about. DeGruy calls Black people the miracle people. You have to wonder what contributes to that. And the resilience piece is huge. Okay. Where are we? Polling. We have a little bit of a poll to run here, and then we're going to wrap up.
Oh, Judy, you wanted to say something? Judy Bond?
Judy, there you go.
Yeah. Am I muted?
No, we hear you.
Okay, no, I just wanted to say something because through all of this, it tells a story of how I felt concerning the Jews. I was very aware of my German heritage, and I took a course once in college. I was at USF at the time, and had something to do with cultures and this sort of thing anyway. And our professor frequently came to class with a kaftan on. He was African. And I remember we had to write something, and I can't remember what it had to, you know, what the topic was supposed to be. Anyhow, I wrote something about my feelings relating to the a certain amount of shame being of German descent, knowing what they did to the Jews. And he said, you should never be ashamed of your background. You didn't do anything to anybody. And I have always thought that the Jewish section of the country was a very resilient. I guess I looked upon them as what we're saying now about Black people and their resilience. But when I grew up, I had no exposure to Black people at all. So I didn't know anything, and I'm still pretty ignorant. But I see now, and now it makes me curious to know whether all groups would be resilient as well. I don't know if that's just me and my drive to do research, but I think you probably find that we're all up for it if it comes to that. But I just want to basically want to say I'm learning so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
One thing I just want to add, I think, resilience exists amongst many people, but let's just remember one thing. If you're Black, you're always Black. And coming from German Jewish immigrants, I could assimilate much easier. So resilience certainly is a quality that we see across the board, but the opportunity to meld or blend, bless you, eventually happens. If you're someone of color, you have to have that added resilience because you can't just disappear into the background. So I think that's one of the things, because again, we breathe the air of racism. Wanting to or not, we have to work so hard to do what we're doing, become aware, start observing our internal responses so that we can make those adjustments, and then be more and more comfortable to have these conversations, be willing to reach out, and be willing to, even if we make a mistake. One of the conversation they talked about, sometimes we may be clumsy, but we still need to make the effort. So I think resilience is a tremendous quality, and many of us can look in our own history, our own past, at difficulties we may have gone through. But the one added piece, again, is if you're Black, you're always Black, and that's what makes it so much harder in this country.
Thanks, Jackie. I think that's true.
And
Okay.
And I hate to interrupt because I know we have to do this, but Annette wanted to say.
Annette's hand is up. Yeah, Annette.
Hi, sorry, I turned my camera off because I'm moving around the house, but I wanted to say, I hear the word resilience a lot, and I'm not sure that we are as much resilient as we are persistent, as we are enduring, because the meaning of resilience in my mind is always being able to come back quickly, being able to recover quickly. And I think after 400 years, we still have not, that has not been a quick, nor does it continue to be a quick process. We have not gone back to what we were when this 400-year journey started. So I actually like to say that I believe we are a people of endurance, persistence, and we have moved from being hopeless and helpless to being more hopeful, and hopefully we will be able to become more powerful in our own skin as the people that we can be and should be. But that was it. Thank you.
I like that, Annette. I'm a language person, and I'm well aware that words have meanings, and you need to be careful the words that you use so you can communicate effectively and precisely. That you have just reframed that idea for me, and I find that helpful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. Jackie, do you have the access to the poll to run that? And I'm going to put up the questions for the purpose of our sharing.
I did, oh yeah, you're going to read them, right? There you go.
Yeah, hang on. Oops, wrong one.
It was up there.
Yeah, I know, and then it wasn't. There it is.
Okay.
Okay. First polling question. Learning about post-traumatic slave syndrome has changed my perception of people of color. It's a yes or no response.
And this is anonymous, just let's.
This is anonymous, yeah. I was aware of the connection between racism and trauma before this meeting. 3, I was familiar with epigenetics before viewing the DeGruy video.
Wow.
And with apologies to Annette, because I wrote this before, I now see resilience as a characteristic of the Black community. Fill in the blank. Looks like we've got all of our. No, we're still waiting.
Well, there were only 3 questions.
No, 4. The 4th one was the
But
resilience.
It didn't have, it didn't have a yes, no box.
Which one? We have one.
Resilience. You need to scroll down a little bit. Maybe there's a scroll on the side of that.
Yeah, I saw it on mine.
Do you see it?
If you just scroll right on it itself, not on a sidebar, you just scroll down on the question itself.
Yeah.
You can scroll or there's a sidebar you can move.
No, it's not showing up.
What is it, the last question?
I now see resilience as a characteristic of the Black community. There's.
It shows that everyone has answered it if they answered the others.
Yeah. Okay. So we're going to end polling. And here are the results. Wow. It's a powerful concept, this post-traumatic slave syndrome.
Has changed my perception, 90%, yes.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing that. And we now have a new share. Well, wait a minute. I think we're done. So thank you, all of you, for participating. We have a little homework for you. We're now ending 2020. Some of us would say, thank heaven.
Thank God.
Soon enough. And typically, many of us make New Year's resolutions. So over the holiday, consider a New Year's resolution that you might make based on what you have learned in these discussions. So chew on that for a while. Our next discussion will be January 27th, same time. And Jackie will be leading us in a discussion of microaggressions. The invitation to register along with preparatory materials will be out in January. We will also be sending you a link to our Survey Monkey. Please respond. And in the meantime, we wish you a joyous, peaceful, serene, and healthy holiday season. Everybody be well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.